Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this EPC policy dialogue on COP28 outcomes and next steps for global cooperation. The event is held in collaboration with the Global Solutions Initiative and will be followed by additional discussions this year on the global dimensions of climate action in the context of EPC's Connecting Europe project with the German Mercator Foundation. I'm Brooke, a policy analyst with the Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program at the European Policy Center, and will be moderating this session today. Due to unforeseen events, Diana Concha will no longer be able to join us today. However, we have the pleasure of having with us today Dimitrios Sevgolis, Head of Unit for Multilateral Affairs in DG Klima and Deputy Head of the EU Delegation to the UNFCCC, who should be hopefully joining us soon. Ambassador Mohamed Al-Sahlawi, the United Arab Emirates Ambassador to the European Union. Damon Jones, the Head of Climate Diplomacy at Climate Analytics. And Tabea Lissner, Research Director for Global Solutions Initiative. We really appreciate you all being here with us today. I'll start with just a few words of introduction, and then we'll be delighted to hear from our speakers on their reflections and insights. We are aware of the profound challenges posed by climate change affecting every aspect of our lives, from our health to our economy. As the years progress, the impacts of climate change are only increasing in severity, further exacerbated by crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, global action to address climate change is more vital than ever. COP28 was anticipated as a milestone conference, marking the conclusion of the first global stocktake. This stocktake was not just a reflection of our progress in climate action, but also a crucial determinant of our path forward. The importance of the stocktake was only heightened by the realization that we were not on track to meet the Paris Agreement's necessary targets, specifically to limit global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius with a goal of 1.5. As always, the conference reflected a diverse and complex set of goals. Negotiations at COP28 reflected this plurality, covering a broad spectrum of critical issues, including the energy transition, climate financing, and adaptation, to name just a few. Now that we're on the other side of COP28, there's been a mixed response on whether COP28 achieved its goals. Some praise it as quite a success, while others question whether enough is still being done to get us on track to keep the goal alive. These reflections are something that we hope to explore more in our discussions today. So we're very delighted to hear from our 4 speakers and your insights on what the various objectives going into COP28 were, and how successful the conference was in achieving these objectives. What were the greatest achievements? Where did the conference fall short? And what does this path forward look like? During today's session, we greatly encourage questions from the audience. So I ask that as the session goes on, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A chat in the form of short written questions, or alternatively, during the Q&A session, you can simply raise your hand and we can give the floor to you to ask your questions. So to begin, I will first hand the floor over to Ambassador Al-Sahlawi, who is the United Arab Emirates Ambassador to the European Union. Thank you so much. I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, and I would like to thank first the EPC for hosting us and for holding this important discussion on the crucial outcomes of COP28. And I would also like to use this opportunity to express my thanks to EPC for their excellent work here in Brussels, where your valuable work, whether it is in seminars or holding those discussions, papers you publish, have really helped me, myself, my team at the embassy to better understand European policies, challenges, and bridging the gap between the foreign missions here in Brussels and our stakeholders. I think it is important, before starting the discussion, to take note of why hosting COP28 was important to us. About 20 years ago, the leadership in the UAE recognized that climate change will alter global dynamics and the importance of diversification, or if I may use a word that is being in vogue right now here in Brussels, de-risking. And de-risking for us, of course, includes our energy mix. Following the science and looking at the numbers, climatologists have warned that the Middle East will be an uninhabitable place by the end of this century. And if the 1.5 degrees agreed upon target in Paris is not respected, the Middle East will be 4 degrees warmer by 2050. So you can see how climate change is existential to us. That's why hosting COP in the UAE was something very crucial. And it was natural for us since 20 years ago to heavily invest in renewable energy, carbon-free technologies, and make our energy mix cleaner to achieve our net zero ambition by 2045. Beyond that, the UAE also in this topic in climate change wishes to position itself as a global problem solver. And the climate change crisis is one of the most pressing existential threats for humanity to solve. So we wanted to be an active part of the solution, hosting and working for a successful COP to ensure we all remain on course to meet our collective goals was a natural step. In doing so, we knew we truly wanted to take a holistic approach involving all sectors, all stakeholders, all leaders, all regions, leaving no one behind, and develop a framework for a COP of actionable promises and ambitions. Today, in the aftermath of COP28, it is impossible to ignore the urgency of addressing climate change. The world needed to find a new way, and together we might have found it. And this is a successful multilateral cooperation is only the beginning of the road. As the president of COP28, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber said in his closing remarks, an agreement is as good as its implementation. So it's not time to rest after COP. It's actually time for us to work harder and make the UAE consensus a reality. First and foremost, COP28 has demonstrated the power of international collaboration and that multilateralism still works and can deliver and is able to resolve problems. The discussions and negotiations that took place during the conference highlighted the shared responsibility collectively speaking. And in an unprecedented reference, the UAE consensus was able to make a reference in the final text to transitioning away from all fossil fuels to enable the world to reach net zero by 2050. COP28 marked a significant milestone by introducing the inaugural Health Day, a groundbreaking move that underscored the intrinsic connection between climate security and a sustainable future. This was a global first. There were many global firsts that took place in COP28, and this tells you a lot about how the leadership and how the UAE thinks about these things and linking different issues that are not only important to the UAE and not only important to our region, but important to end of the list, especially coming out of the pandemic. So COP28 acknowledged the substantial health benefits arising from robust climate actions, such as reduction of air pollution and the lowering of healthcare costs. The pivotal announcement coincided with a stark reality because as we following the science, looking at the number, nearly 9 million lives are lost each year due to polluted air. Heat-related illness and fatalities are on the rise. And a staggering 189 million people confront extreme weather events annually. The UAE, with its long-standing commitment to this critical issue, took a resolute stand against these challenges. Over 120 nations rallied behind the Climate and Health Declaration at COP28, pledging approximately $500 million for climate and health initiatives to substantiate their political commitments. Another remarkable achievement at COP28 was the central role accorded to food systems transformation. Beyond just highlighting the importance of food systems, we witnessed 130 countries representing a population of over 5.7 billion, which is 70% of global food consumption, nearly 500 million farmers, and 76% of total food system emissions, signing up to the COP28 declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, and climate action. A staggering 2.5 billion mobilized to champion the food climate agenda alongside the launch of the 200 million Partnership for Food Systems and Agriculture Innovation by the UAE and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. COP28 delivered historic outcomes beyond the global stocktake. It breathed life into the loss and damage framework, securing early pledges totaling to $792 million. It established a framework for the global goal on adaptation, and institutionalized the role of youth climate champions. For us, youth plays a very important role in the development of our country. More than 60% of the Middle East is below the age of 35. So it was important for us to ensure youth inclusion in future COP discussions also, not only in COP, not only in the UAE, but beyond that as well. Addressing a key global climate challenge, COP28 focused on mitigating methane emissions. In a significant development, COP28 President Sultan Al-Jaber successfully convinced 50 oil and gas companies to commit to net zero methane emissions by 2030. This decision, one of the most impactful by the private sector at any COP that ever took place, sets a precedent for the entire industry beyond 2030. Building on this private sector engagement, COP President Al-Jaber launched the Industrial Transition Accelerator, which is a comprehensive initiative to tackle the dual challenge of clean energy and energy-intensive industries by fostering collaboration among government, industry, and finance leaders. A lot has been done in COP28. COP28 underscored the urgency of enhancing adaptation and mitigation efforts, especially in vulnerable regions. We call for increased collaboration on technology transfer, capacity building, and financial support for developing nations, sustainable and resilient development. Looking ahead, we must prioritize the implementation of the UAE consensus. Concrete actions, transparent reporting, and robust accountability are essential to ensure that countries fulfill their commitments. While many nations have made substantial financial pledges, we must ensure they translate into meaningful actions. Addressing, for example, the financial gap for climate action, especially in developing countries, is not only a responsibility of one country or one region, but it's a shared responsibility by the international community. The international community must mobilize resources to support vulnerable nations in adapting to climate change impacts and transitioning to sustainable development pathways. We saw how loud the voices of small island states were in COP28, rightly so. Further, also under the UAE's leadership, COP28 marked a pivotal moment for global climate action, balancing substantially with economic and social development. However, it was essential to remember that our planet's health and well-being are collective responsibility. There is much work ahead, and COP28 has set us on a more promising path. Now it is incumbent upon all parties to turn words into action. For us as a responsible global citizens, we stand ready to contribute to the collective efforts needed to address the climate crisis and secure a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this overview. You touched upon numerous important topics discussed at COP28, including scaling up renewable energy, loss and damage, health initiatives, the financial gap. I'm sure we will have the opportunity to circle back to these topics either in the discussion or perhaps also from others in the panel. To introduce our next speaker, we will be hearing from Dimitrios Sevgelis, Head of Unit for Multilateral Affairs in DG Klima and Deputy Head of the EU Delegation to the UNFCCC. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitations, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to reflect on the recent conference of the parties to the UNFCCC. I might repeat some of the points that His Excellency Ambassador mentioned already. Maybe one thing that I would like to take the opportunity of saying is that we really appreciate the leadership of the United Arab Emirates. It was indeed a very strong presidency of this conference of the parties. There has been direct communication with the presidency, with all the parties during the negotiations, and I think that facilitated a very good outcome of this COP. Now, I wouldn't like to repeat all the points that we have heard. Maybe from the European Union perspective, I would like to highlight that this COP came against a background that is quite challenging. Already, the world came out of a pandemic with an increase of energy consumption after a short dip for a couple of years in the consumption of fossil fuels. And I think that at the same time, the realization that climate change is here to stay, with very strong impacts for all the societies across the world, no matter whether these societies are belonging to developed or developing economies. This has been a realization for all of us that we need to do better, we need to do much more, especially to secure that the temperature increase will not go beyond the 1.5 degrees. And we already experienced heavy impacts with an average temperature increase at 1.2 degrees. Already 2023 has been registered as a record year when it comes to temperature increase, and already we have days during the past months that we have hit average temperature increase beyond 2 degrees. So the impacts are here to stay, and I think that it is important that already all the societies across the world realize that we need to do more in order to fight climate change. So this realization, I think that it was quite important for shaping the results of this COP, because in this COP we saw the global stocktake, of course, a very important moment that has already been designed 8 years ago with the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And we didn't have to think much for realizing that we're not doing what we need to do in order to keep temperature increase under control. So we went to this COP with this understanding, and we all consider that we need to decide how we're gonna go forward. And I think that there are many ways of reading the outcome of the COP. Some people might see optimistic messages there, and others might consider that there are some negative elements that we are not doing enough. But I will say that we have strong signals when it comes to the course correction. Now, let me specify where we see the strong signal. From our side, we see that the signal that is the strongest is that this COP, following the other two COPs in Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh, really specify that we need to intervene much more when it comes to the energy systems, when it comes to the emissions that come from the energy systems. So already in Glasgow, we took decisions, we specified as a COP outcome that we need to phase down the consumption of coal in coal power plants, and we need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. This message was repeated last year, and it is repeated this year as well, but now by urging countries, by calling countries to accelerate these efforts. But we have new elements as well. We have more specific technological elements when it comes to transport, when it comes to sectoral emissions, when it comes to emissions, non-CO2 emissions. And we have a strong signal for accelerating emission reductions in this decade, in this critical decade. So, and this signal is presented by two particular elements of the CMA decision that have to do with the tripling of renewable energy capacity by the end of the decade and the doubling of energy efficiency improvements by the end of the decade as well as a call for transition away from fossil fuels. Now, a lot has been written regarding the conundrum between phase out of fossil fuels and the final decision on the transition away from fossil fuels. I will not stick on the words, the exact words. I think that the important signal is that we have a decision that calls for the whole world to move away from fossil fuels, whether this is expressed as phase out, phase down, or in other words, as transition. I think that the signal is pretty clear. It's unequivocal that fossil fuels don't have a space in the future energy system, that we need to move away from fossil fuels in order to reduce emissions and essentially to eliminate emissions, anthropogenic emissions. So that's a very important signal from this COP. And as I said, if somebody was asking me 4 years ago whether we will have COP decisions that will be specific on the energy sector, I would consider it a pipe dream, to be honest, because always the UNFCCC was very difficult to get into the sectoral decisions in the UNFCCC. But now we have seen a great turn happening since Glasgow, and I think that this is what the world is needed. We need to take decisions that are much more focused on how we will deliver these emission reductions, not just aspirational targets. The second element of the second deliverable of this COP, and we heard about this, is a demonstration of the solidarity of the developed world to developing world, and particularly for the most vulnerable. And this has been expressed with a decision on the operationalization of the fund responding to loss and damage caused by climate change impacts. So the fact that we saw in the course of almost an hour an initial capitalization of this fund with over $700 million US, that was quite unique. We have never seen before in the development of the UNFCCC regime and the development of different UNFCCC-related funds, anything like that. So that was a very strong signal, and I think that it was quite important for shaping the confidence that we can have a sincere discussion in this COP for achieving our targets. Now, of course, not everything is so positive, because of course in the 2 weeks of the COP, we saw a lot of discussion regarding how far we can go when it comes to specifying such targets, like the tripling and the doubling of renewable energy and the doubling of energy efficiency improvements, or how we will express the transition away from fossil fuels. So definitely we had some really difficult discussions there, and we had also difficult discussions that have to do with the global goal on adaptation and its relation to the delivery of means of implementation for achieving this goal. So not everything was rosy. However, that's how multilateral negotiations are. We need to have these discussions and come up with multilaterally agreed outcomes. And the way that I see it is that now that we have these decisions in place and we have certain procedures that will follow up, maybe for some of us, these procedures are not, these processes that we have established in this COP as an outcome of the global stocktake are not enough. They are not strong enough. At least from my point of view, we could try to have something stronger as an outcome when it comes to the way forward. Nevertheless, they offer hooks for our discussions in the next years. So already we have certain guidance that will help us shape our national determined contributions for the next decade beyond 2030. All the countries are asked to take into account the outcomes of this global stocktake in the design of their national determined contributions, and also they're encouraged to design national determined contributions that they will be economy-wide and they will cover all greenhouse gases and sectors. So this is a very important message. But at the same time, all countries are asked to accelerate their action in this critical decade. And for that, we have the mitigation work program. We have a process for the next 2 years for this mitigation work program to look into these subjects, to look into the subject of the transition away from fossil fuels, to look into the subject of renewables, of fossil fuel subsidies, of coal phase down, as well of energy efficiency. So we need to use this space in order to secure more ambition in this critical decade. So it's not enough that we have this decision, of course. We really need to use these opportunities in the next years to have stronger outcomes in the next COPs. And of course, the COPs are just moments. They are moments where the international community comes together. But we have to think what we are doing in the course of the year. And then we have very important moments in the course of the year. We have the G7 meetings. We have the G20, the major economies that represent 80% of the global emissions, that we need to use these moments in order to operationalize all these outcomes of the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC. So with that, I would like to say that the European Union will continue focusing on that. We are, of course, now preparing our next NDC based on the outcome of this global stocktake. We are now discussing our next target for 2040. And soon we will present our proposition as European Commission for that. So we will continue showing our leadership as European Union towards this target, but at the same time we'll continue cooperating with the other countries, since our emissions are already quite limited. They're almost 7% of the global emissions, so reducing only our emissions will not be enough. We need to have other major emitters to come forward, and our international cooperation will focus on this topic as well. Thank you very much for giving me the space.
Thank you very much. As you stressed, we need to do more, and the impacts are here to stay. And while, as you said, this realization shaped COP28 and its outcomes, such as the emphasis towards the energy transition. It will be interesting to get into this question of how a bit more and understanding what the road ahead may look like to do more. So for our next speaker, we're delighted to hear from Damon Jones, who is head of climate diplomacy at Climate Analytics. Please, the floor is yours, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Brooke, and to my fellow panelists, thanks for your contributions. Great to be here, and thanks to the EPC for the opportunity to have a chance to provide these reflections today. I have to confess that I'm still recovering from my 3 weeks in Dubai, hoping my sort of dreams involving new textual proposals around fossil fuel phase out, they hope they fade soon, because it was an intense time. I was there with 3 hats on. I was there as head of the climate diplomacy team at Climate Analytics. I was also there as an advisor on mitigation issues under the GST and the mitigation work program to Samoa in its role as chair of the Alliance of Small Island States, and as an advisor to the Grenada delegation also. I'm speaking though today very much in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the groups that I was supporting during the COP. So yeah, it was quite a bruising COP, but also more importantly, I guess it was a very consequential one, as the ambassador and Dimitri have already outlined in terms of its significance. There was a lot at stake, and there was a lot of heavy politics involved, given the seriousness of the issues that were being considered. Certainly at the centre of it all was the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement. And as AOSIS and others were saying in Dubai, it's really the first global stocktake, but really the only one that really matters in terms of its outcome and the follow through in response to the outcome, in terms of ensuring that we can still limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And I agree with the ambassador's comments about the agreement only being as good as its implementation. I think that's certainly true, and I think I also agree with the reflection that I think the GST outcome and the broader package around the UAE consensus does demonstrate the success of multilateralism, and does demonstrate the continued importance and buy-in to the Paris Agreement and its role in trying to deliver on the goals that we've all collectively set. So in terms of my main takeaways from the COP, I'm going to suggest just 4, and they do overlap a bit from what we've already heard, but hopefully can just bring some additional perspectives to it. So first, I think that the loss and damage outcome was a very significant part of this COP, as it was last year as well in COP27, and probably the most significant climate finance outcome at this COP in terms of taking a big step forward. So in adopting a decision to operationalise the fund on the opening day, I think it was a big symbolic step, and not one without political risk, given what else was before us for the remainder of the COP. But really the decision secured the recommendations made by the Transitional Committee and all its work during the year, and put in place really a clear plan for the design and start-up of the fund, with the World Bank being given the opportunity to prove that it can be fit for purpose in its role as host of the fund over an interim period of 4 years. Really for small island developing states and least developed countries as the most vulnerable countries in the process, this outcome combined with the outcome last year really, I think, can be said to be a sort of quantum leap in terms of recognition of the need for specific institutional arrangements being put in place for loss and damage, and ones that are equipped to provide finance at real scale to address the escalating impacts and loss and damage in all its forms. So extreme weather events, slow onset events, economic loss, non-economic loss. Also the outcome on the Santiago network in terms of agreeing on a host, with the proposal from the UNDRR and UNOPS. sorry, a bit acronym heavy, was obviously an important sort of adjunct to the fund outcome. Second, I think in terms of outcomes, the very strong message that came through on science and on reaffirming the commitment to keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. Science was very much at the heart of the GST decision. It was at the heart of what was being communicated by the UAE presidency in terms of 1.5 being the North Star. And the fact that all parties to the Paris Agreement really reaffirmed the commitment to keep 1.5 within reach is significant as an outcome. But there was also really strong confirmation and welcoming of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sixth assessment report cycle, and its key findings on impacts. There were clear messages in the decisions around the feasibility of 1.5 and the need for, or the outlining the fact that there are feasible, effective, low-cost mitigation options very much available across all sectors that can be implemented to keep 1.5 within reach. There's a clear reference to the fact that 1.5 degree pathways show a peak in global emissions before 2025 in paragraph 26 of the GST outcome. There were some earlier iterations of the text around a stronger commitment and resolve to achieve that peaking goal, which didn't end up in the final text. But that combined with the explicit recognition of the IPCC science around rapid reductions to achieve 43% reductions by 2030 and 60% reductions by 2035, combined with the peaking reference, provide a really clear outline of expectations around where we're all collectively heading over the rest of this critical decade and beyond. Third, I would say the decisions outline very clearly expectations on parties between now and COP30 in 2025 in Brazil about current NDCs as well as the new NDCs that are going to be coming forward by early 2025. So the nationally determined contributions that are required to be implemented and new ones every 5 years by parties, with 2025 as the next milestone. So the GST, the Global Stocktake Decision, did a lot in terms of providing the messaging around expectations on this, in terms of very clearly identifying the ambition and implementation gaps, with reference back to the science, the IPCC in particular. Provisions that outline how through enhanced NDCs parties can close those gaps in alignment with the 1.5 degree limit. There's further repeating of the calls, requests from the Glasgow COP and the Sharm el-Sheikh COP around revisiting and strengthening 2030 targets in current NDCs, which is critical for the halving of emissions this decade, that further strengthening of current NDCs happens. And there's encouragement to bring forward next NDCs with ambitious economy-wide targets, so messaging around covering all greenhouse gases, all sectors aligned with 1.5. There's also a range of support initiatives and opportunities to provide follow-through and accountability in relation to that work through things like the Technology Implementation Program, which was established. There's events coming up in terms of an annual global stocktake dialogue where parties can reflect on progress made with NDCs, a United Nations Secretary General event, and a couple of other things to really bring into focus the task at hand leading up to 2025 and that next key political moment. Fourth, I would say the energy package, obviously, as has already been outlined, a key a key outcome of the COP and really important signals through its provisions and the already well-known paragraph 28 in the GST decision, which calls on parties to contribute on a range of fronts, as has been outlined in relation to tripling renewable energy, doubling energy efficiency, the important wording around transitioning away from fossil fuels in the energy systems, including a specific reference to accelerating action in this decade in relation to that, the acceleration of action on non-CO2 emissions, particularly methane, unfortunately without the specific reduction targets, but the signal is still there. So having those suite of measures in place, I think, is it is unprecedented in a COP decision, and it is a step forward for sure. However, the text is, I mean, it was a political compromise, and there are significant compromises coming through in that text that I think creates some mixed messages and some potential loopholes that, if acted upon, could take us backwards rather than forwards towards 1.5. For example, in the context of abatement or transitional fuels. So, in terms of those loopholes, I think a key opportunity and a key need going forward is to really remind ourselves that this is all based on the science and the desire to keep 1.5 within reach. And as has been said, the next 2 years and beyond in terms of implementation of the GST outcome is going to be really key in terms of all parties showing that they're committed to taking this in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. So references to things like carbon capture and storage, which are there in the text, recognising that that's going to play a really negligible role this decade in terms of contributing to the emissions reduction task, and ensuring that its role where it is there is confined to hard to abate sectors, areas limited capacity over the much longer term. The focus on energy systems referenced in the text doesn't exclude some of the important reductions required in emissions intensive processes outside of the energy sector, from chemicals, steel, fertilizer production, etc. So ensuring that they're not left out. Recognition in paragraph 29 to transitional fuels is there, but recognising that, as the science says, we know from, for example, the International Energy Agency that there's no room for expansion of gas as a transition fuel if we're to be serious about staying within the 1.5 degree limit, rather the opposite. So this sort of qualified language and flexibility that's available needs to be manoeuvred in the right direction to ensure that we're implementing these opportunities all in the right direction. I think if it is done in the right way, then yes, there are some obstacles still in place, but there's a huge range of opportunities and potential for this decision to really unleash that next phase of really ambitious action. But as Ayosa said in the closing plenary, the course correction needed for 1.5, it hasn't yet been secured. I think we've taken an important step in that direction, but it's really going to require strong and early leadership by governments around the world to ensure that the outcome from the global stocktake really does deliver that course correction that we know is critical. And so really the actions over this next 2 years are going to determine, I think, whether we can call COP28 a success. With that, thank you very much. I'll pass you back to Brooke. Thanks, Brooke.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and takeaways. Some of the takeaways you listed, including loss and damage, reaffirming, which I'm sure we'll circle back to. And yeah, we've seen an important step in the right direction, but we need more to make sure the global stocktake delivers. And I look forward to diving into this a bit more. I will now hand it over to our last speaker, Tabea Lissner, who is Research Director of Global Solutions Initiative. Really delighted to hear from you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Lovely. Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to also share my thoughts today. And it's I of course have the I guess, privileged to have, perfectly had set the scene by the three previous speakers who were actually at COP this year. I wasn't able to attend myself, but obviously followed whatever I could find. And will, I guess, provide some reflections also more on an outlook towards the next year, also with a view to G20 that has already been mentioned, which is of course going to be very, very important. I think a lot of the things that I want to touch upon have also been mentioned by the previous speakers. So of course, I guess in terms of the outside view, there's very mixed views, as has been mentioned, as well as to whether the outcome of this year's COP is more to be seen as a historic landmark outcome, or whether whether it's not whether it isn't. I think it's as has been mentioned before, it definitely is sets very clearly the scene in terms of focusing on the transitioning away from fossil fuels, and I think it's one of the very most important messages, I think, that has also been very visible all across the reporting. I think all three speakers have already pointed it out. Of course, it's one thing to have an agreement, but any agreement is only as good as its implementation. I think Damon also picked up this quote, because I do think it's very, very important. And as we've seen, there was a very clear commitment to the overall phase out of fossil fuels, and clearly also the recognition that this is something that really requires immediate attention. So in terms of what I think is needed over the next year is really a very clear signal to really act on this agreement as well, in order to really have that commitment also within this critical decade. Damon also referenced very clearly the IPCC, that very clearly then also states that it is a critical decade, and emissions overall do need to peak ideally before 2025. And I think in particular also for the EU, that was quite vocal also for a preference for much stronger language in the outcome, if I understood correctly. I think going forward, very clear action to continue on the ambitious path of decarbonization will be very important. Other aspects, such as CBAM, for example, have shown quite clearly how much of an influence the EU can have overall in implementing ambitious action, and then also having a global effect. I think what's very important also to recognize, also in terms of the linkage to climate finance, but also in terms of technology transfer, capacity building, that has also been mentioned before, is really that decarbonization, of course, and phasing out or transitioning away from fossil fuels is not just a domestic question then in terms of implementation, but also very much one of international collaboration, where in many parts of the global south, there's still a massive need for investing in expanding energy systems, and any investments that are taken now also create an infrastructure that might then create a lock-in for the longer term. So I think these transfer mechanisms going forward, and also having that very clearly on the table, will be super important in order to make true on the promise to really phase out fossil fuels, and then transitioning away from that on the long term. Of course, another area to highlight, I think, is really, as has been mentioned before, of course, the loss and damage fund that has been agreed very early on in the negotiations. Of course, it's also important to note, I think, in this context, while it is absolutely essential that finally there is agreement, and that the modalities have really been agreed early on, and there's a solid way forward on the table, that there is also still a lot to be worked out in that regard going forward. So I think a lot of work still needs to be invested in that, not necessarily only within within the COP process, but overall. of course, that ranges from questions around access to finance that still needs to be discussed. If I understand correctly, there's also questions still around the final name of this fund, which will be interesting as well. But I think what's absolutely essential going forward is also a clearer agreement on how to pay into this fund, to really make sure that it does operate at the scale that is needed. Of course, it's been very important from the very beginning, and quite, I think, an historic achievement to already have substantive pledges to that fund throughout COP. But of course, as we know also, I guess, out of the IPCC report, but also more broadly, the scale of impact that we already see today is huge. And what is currently on the table, I think some estimates indicated that this was around 0.2% of what might actually be needed to cover costs. Of course, it's absolutely impossible to actually accurately calculate the overall needs for funding for loss and damage. But of course, this is a very, very important question that remains on the table. And it's, of course, also essential to note that whatever is needed in terms of addressing loss and damage is kind of intrinsically linked also to ambitious climate action, as well as adaptation, and to really take that into account in any questions going forward. Being the research director of the Global Solutions Initiative, I do want to kind of broaden the picture a little bit as well. Of course, the climate crisis is existential in many regards, and probably the most pressing issue for the next few years. But we do also live in a time of polycrisis, it has been called. And clearly urgent action is needed to address climate or emission reductions. But I think it's very important to also recognize that any solution that is being brought forward really needs to be cognizant of the broader transformation that is also needed to address issues such as the biodiversity loss, pollution, inequality, and poverty. So I think Damon also pointed this out before as well. There's many, of course, technical approaches as well that might be at some point in the future also be an element towards reducing emissions. But besides the fact that these are of course very costly and not necessarily they're absolutely not an alternative to actual emission reduction, even if a technological approach in itself might be able to reduce emissions and limit warming, and all of the other issues that we're still facing, of course, are still on the table. So in terms of facing the big challenges that we have currently on the table, I think it's really important to recognize that we do have limited resources, not only in terms of finance, of course, that is a major issue as well, but also in terms of what can actually possibly be done in parallel. So really creating synergies, and it's been pointed out before that, of course, this is recognized in many, many different areas in terms of the health benefits, in terms of other areas that where we really need to link sectoral approaches. And I think it's really, really essential to really keep that in mind. And of course, the IPCC report is also very clear about this as well. And it is a central piece of science that really underlies this. So I guess to summarize, I think stepping away from COP into a year full of challenges and into a G20 presidency led by Brazil. Of course, there is very strong recognition of the kind of breadth of challenges that are on the table. I think the COP outcomes are extremely important in guiding the way there, and have really on a number of issues that have been outlined by all of the speakers here, have really opened a lot of the space where we really see that we do need now to take action and to work on implementation. So hopefully we will have a very interesting year ahead with a lot of focus on implementation and really embedding a lot of the important kind of starting points that come out of COP into other global processes, including G20, to really see significant progress on solving the climate crisis.
Thank you very much for your insights. It seems that most of the chats have already been addressed, but we'll open this up now to a Q&A discussion. And I'd actually like to pick up on a point that you had made, Dr. Lissner, and that is implementation. So as we know, corporations play a pivotal role in addressing climate change. A question in the chat addressed to the topic of corporate social responsibility, and we have a new chat regarding the carbon credit market, and that was on the agenda for COP28. So I'd like to pose the question to all of our speakers, being what the conversation at COP28 looked like regarding the role corporations will or should play in climate action, perhaps covering successes, challenge, or how they can be better incorporated to ensure that corporate or their contribution to climate action, and maybe even more broadly, just the general, how can global cooperation be strengthened to more effectively address the urgent challenges posed by climate change to ensure this implementation? Perhaps Ambassador, we could start with you and then go around.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have enough institutions, enough frameworks that we can work through to keep the conversation going. There are not only different multilateral forums that the international community have created all together, but also many minilateral forums that we have that are out there. For example, the G20, G7, regional organizations. How can we empower regional organization, region to region cooperation in order to address climate change? That could be in the form of best practices, cooperation, some sort of partnerships that can result out of that. And then thinking about it more holistically. For example, in the UAE, climate change is no longer limited only to one department or one entity. Climate change is being incorporated in different organizations in the UAE. So, for example, climate change now is a central part in our development and humanitarian assistance to other countries. So that always gets the priority when we are studying a development project in country X, Y, or Z. So I don't think there is one collaborative entity that will obviously naturally be the United Nations under the leadership of the UNFCCC, but also there are multiple other forums that climate change should be central to it and no longer be ignored. Thank you.
Thank you. And Demetrius, I know that you have to leave soon. Would you possibly have time to answer this, or should we take it round?
Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. Yes, indeed, I have to leave in a minute. What can I add in this case? I would say that we have a way forward now with the COP decisions. We really need to follow up on that, but we cannot rely only on what the multilateral process is offering to us. As you mentioned, Brooke, earlier, and the previous speaker, Tabea, we really need to focus on what else we can do with the other plurilateral fora during the year. So I think we need to use every opportunity in this direction to have much more ambition in this critical decade in that sense. So that's what will be the focus of my team for the next months, I would say, and of course to prepare for the next COP for the mitigation work program in the next COP to bring the realization of the outcomes of the global stocktake. In fact.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us today. Dr. Lissner, or would you perhaps take the floor next?
Yes, sure. I'm happy to add a little bit, even though, of course, I think we've moved on quite a bit from the initial question, but just to also reiterate, I think what's been said before, that yeah, there's just a lot of different processes that really need to pick up the different elements and really focus on very specific activities or actions across different sectors to really to be able to implement the change that we need. I mean, there's different initiatives that I think were also launched and very visible in the COP context. Just to mention one, the German government has the initiative of the climate clubs that really wants to focus on hard to abate sectors or industries that really is starting to have a very specific focus to raise ambition there and really bring action into different sectors. So yeah, I think it just needs to we do need continuous focus across different areas of actions, not just COP, but really in between, to really see those milestones, also to really step up ambition over the year.
Thank you. And then we can finish it with Damon, if you would mind going and just bring it back more on the global cooperation, but also this role of what perhaps corporations should be playing, or the discussion surrounding that at COP28.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I think from COP28, I think we all recognize that every part of society has a role to play in delivering on the very strong signals and the very strong direction that's come through from the COP, and corporations are obviously very important in that context, both in terms of the outputs that they're producing, as well as the capital that they're moving. And so their practices as corporations, but also where they choose to invest, and is going to be really critical in terms of the transition that we're talking to. So it's about embedding these climate considerations in decision making across the board within the corporation context. And I think we've seen a lot of initiatives announced as part of COP28 across an expanse of areas outside the formal negotiations. And I think that they have huge potential, and commend the presidency for bringing some additional areas into focus. As Tabea said, there are a whole lot of related issues to climate that need to have our attention as well. And I think that a lot was achieved in terms of bringing the spotlight onto those issues that are relevant from a corporation perspective, as well as other areas. But I guess the key thing is follow through on that and accountability to the action. I think in some of the previous COPs we've had initiatives announced, and there's a tendency to lose track of whether things have been done in follow-up. So I think the opportunity here for corporations and for the process more generally is to ensure that all these commitments and statements, that there's some follow-through and tracking of progress against them, either brought back into the process in a formal sense or outside it in terms of corporate accountability. I think also there's a risk around false solutions and being seen to be taking action, and some of the efforts being taken are, in a sense, undermining the progress that we need to take in terms of how corporations are choosing to interpret net zero or interpret the availability of the use of offsets rather than necessarily tackling emissions at source, how to deal with Scope 3 emissions, responsibility in relation to those. So how do you, ensuring that the role that corporations are playing is contributing to the role that parties are playing in terms of sovereign states, playing in terms of responding to the outcomes from COP28. I think that's going to be really critical over the next phase. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So transitioning slightly here, just trying to get a bit broader of a scope. With previous conferences, a large question has been, are we still on track to meet the goals outlined in Paris? And as I think all of our speakers discussed, with COP28, it was very much made clear and shaped by the realization that we're not on track, but this reaffirming of a goal to get on track. So I guess I'd like to ask all of you, can we get on track? And if so, what will it take? What are some tangible actions? What are the greatest challenges we face when it comes to scaling up climate action efforts? And on the other hand, what are potentially emerging opportunities or hopes for scaling up climate action efforts? I guess we can do, I'll just go back to you, Ambassador, and then we can just keep the order.
Yes, sure. Thank you. That's a very good question. Which reminds me of, the early discussions that COP President Dr. Sultan was having here in Brussels in his early engagement. And he kept on highlighting that there will be no single solution to combat climate change. We have to do everything. We have to seek every single solution, every single technology in order to combat climate change successfully, collectively, all together. So that, having that in mind, the UAE consensus, and from the discussions where that took place in the UAE last month, it was clear that there is this international awareness, recognition that on the importance of going back on track. There was a clear acknowledgement of the 2050 deadline as a very critical year for us to achieve our commitments. And there were good indications put forward regarding some of what can be achieved. For example, tripling renewable energy and energy efficiency by 2030. That's a very good starting point, because it's a win-win kind of pledge, both for the public, private sector. So we need to seek more of those kind of initiatives, projects, programs that are attractive for both the private, public, and reasonable as well in implementing. I am very let's say I'm cautiously positive, and I am very optimistic coming out of this COP, that there is enough awareness of this existential threat of what is being what are the costs of not addressing climate change early on. And again, once again, there will be no one solution. There will not be one technology that will solve all the problems. We need to do all of them all together. Leave we should not rule out anything in order to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you for this overview and a few words of hope for optimism. Dr. Lissner, I would pose the same question to you regarding what it will take to get on track, challenges and opportunities, but also the opportunity to address a question in the chat regarding implementation and perhaps even evaluation and monitoring as perhaps a challenge or opportunity in your response.
Yes, thanks a lot. The easy question of the day: how can we how can we solve the problem? But of course, there's I think the ambassador has already mentioned many of the aspects that I would say as well. Of course, there is not one single solution, but it's really just every single option needs to be on the table, and there's of course very many different elements depending on what kind of level of decision making we actually look at. I think, to me, one very important underlying question that doesn't seem to be addressed enough is really kind of a reconsideration of what are our definitions of prosperity and progress, and how do we actually define our overall societal goals that we want to reach, to then of course integrate climate into that, but really ensuring that we also can, education, for example, but overall well-being, and really having those linkages in mind that I mentioned before in terms of co-benefits, to really then think back what kind of actions can we actually take to increase overall prosperity while keeping climate in mind. And I do think that that this overall socioeconomic transformation is absolutely essential to address the kind of breadth of issues that we're facing. That is, of course, not very concrete, and there's very concrete things that also need to be done. And we've mentioned the IPCC report quite a lot, and I personally am also quite attached to it, because I'm also do have a little hat as an IPCC author, and was also part of the AR6. But there is obviously, it's a huge report, and there's many different elements in there, but amongst other things also it outlines very clearly that there's a lot of kind of solutions that address kind of the demand side that are kind of on the table, that we could implement quite immediately, that would also be, again, beneficial to those different dimensions of human well-being that I also mentioned before. So there's a lot of kind of low-hanging fruit always sounds so easy, but kind of immediate aspects that we might be able to address much more quickly than the very big transformational decarbonization efforts that are, of course, also needed. I mentioned this before, but I think it's absolutely and utterly very important, is really the investment in new infrastructure. That I think it's absolutely essential that this is focused, of course, on renewables, and that there's a very clear global commitment to doing that. Obviously, there's many challenges that lie in the way of this, and we've seen over the last months as well, that there's obviously other global challenges that again then influence also decisions around investments in different energy infrastructure. But I think this is a super essential one. And I think the ambassador also made a reference just now to the costs of impacts that are absolutely huge. And I think it often kind of when we speak about the cost of transformation, also it gets a little bit into the background, that simply the costs of dealing with the impacts that we would have through progressing climate change it will be incredible. And we don't, unfortunately, have a very good weighing of the costs of impacts versus the costs of mitigation in the same structured way. But what we see very clearly is that the costs will be huge already. The impacts that we're seeing today at below 1.5 degrees of warming are incredible and hard to cope with. And adaptation will become increasingly important, but also increasingly difficult with progressing warming. So just that also as a note, again, just to reiterate that. Maybe a very short point to the implementation question, and I'm sure others also have much to add on that. I think it's quite important, and I think the question already differentiates a few different aspects of this. When we speak about implementation, on the one hand, I think it's a translation of a lot of the global agreements into concrete plans and strategies and actual processes that would translate the agreements into action on the ground. But it's also an additional very, very important step to then also have monitoring and evaluation that ensures that whatever plans are actually developed to translate a global goal into a concrete action on the ground is then actually followed through and also has the anticipated effects in terms of emission reductions. Yeah, I think these are well, at least two very important elements when we speak about implementation.
Thank you, and particularly thinking long-term and taking actions that will help us down the road, but with immediate action items also being taken in addition to these long-term plans. Then over to you, Damon. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, three things I think to respond to your question, Brooke, and the questions in the chat. I mean, to your first question, can we still meet the Paris Agreement goals? Yes, we can, and I think we have to have good reason to stay optimistic, but recognizing that we are facing an incredibly urgent, time-pressing situation where action this decade is paramount, and it really is about what happens this decade. And the science tells us that clearly. It also tells us that there's a huge range of very cost-effective, very scalable, very available solutions out there across sectors, and we know that the cost-competitive role that renewables is going to play in the energy sector is front and center in terms of the rapid emission reductions that are going to be required this decade. Not forgetting, of course, also the other goals in the Paris Agreement and the other areas in the adaptation space in the context of finance. And we're going to have to see really important progress continue in those spaces on the back of the Global Goal and Adaptation Framework decision out of COP and the further work that's going to be done around realising the further work on the targets that have been set and the work that's going to happen around indicators to provide some greater global parameters under which we can assess progress against adaptation goals. And finance, obviously, next year is going to be very important in terms of the new quantified goal on climate finance as a follow-up to the 100 billion current goal to ensure that the scale and reach of that new goal, so reaching across mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, is fit for purpose and going to be at a scale required. So a lot of work still to be done in those spaces to achieve the goals. On the implementation question, there's a range of ways this could be looked at. I'm not going to profess expertise or to speak on behalf of the Commission in terms of their role, but I'd bring it back to the international role. And importantly, next year is going to be the start of reporting under the new enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement, where we'll see the first biannual transparency reports come through by the end of next year, which is designed to provide very clear tracking of progress in terms of emissions reductions, in terms of progress on implementation and achievement of nationally determined contributions, in terms of reporting on adaptation, reporting on loss and damage, reporting on finance, both received and needed and provided. And so these reports that are going to come through greenhouse gas inventories and through the associated parts of the reporting are going to be critical in terms of the point in the question around not just making statements or talking about implementation, actually proving that implementation is happening. Thirdly, on the question around carbon markets in the chat on Article 6, I mean, there has been significant progress in terms of that space in relation to the provision in the Paris Agreement on Article 6 and the rules that have been agreed a couple of years ago now in terms of the rules under Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 in particular, as well as the ongoing discussions under Article 6.8. The issue at this COP, there was attempts to try to reach agreement on the next layer of rules, if you like, in terms of some of the more detailed elements and tables and rules around things like authorization, around methodologies, around how to deal with removals. And some of these were pretty vexed in terms of divergent views on how to approach those issues in terms of the more detailed provisions that are going to be needed to fully operationalise the Article 6 carbon markets regime. And particularly in Article 6.4, there was some discomfort around where it was tracking in relation to the removal space and some disagreement around that wasn't able to be resolved. So there was no conclusion. And so it's back to the, not back to the drawing board, but further negotiation on trying to find a way through on those issues at the COP or through next year and culminating in the COP next year. On 6.2, in terms of cooperative approaches, I think the issue was there were some concerns around potential double counting risks associated with some of the positions being taken in relation to some of the issues there. And so again, that wasn't resolved, but work will continue, and the aim is to have that next layer in place to enable full operationalisation of the centralised mechanism under 6.4 and the cooperative approaches under 6.2. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And being extremely conscientious of time, this will be the final question today, and it's posed again to all three of our speakers. Please also use this as an opportunity to come back to any general comments you'd like to make. But like we discussed, COP is just one event, and we have a lot happening outside of COP. But looking at COP29, what do you hope to see either accomplished by or result from COP29? Thank you. And then Ambassador, if you'd like to start again, just keeping the order. Thank you.
I think what I would like to see in COP29, and I'm sure the Azerbaijan is more than capable of delivering that, is the same level of spirit, commitment by the international community to address climate change. I would like to see the same commitment, the same level of passion to continue, because as we saw in COP28, it's very important for passionate people to continue working, continue being present there, continue to have their voices being heard, following a continuation of following this holistic way of dealing with challenges, looking at more of it as not a problem, but looking at those problems as challenges and opportunities, to how opportunities, turning them into opportunities to benefit from. This is something is so much part of our DNA in the UAE, where we don't like to say that we're facing a problem or a challenge, but the way we think about it, that it's an opportunity for us to learn something new, to tackle something new. So I would like to see a continuation of multilateralism that delivers to the people. For countries like the UAE, like Azerbaijan, but other medium-sized countries, small countries, really all what we have, we thrive when multilateralism works and is being able to deliver to the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lissner.
It's a very interesting question. I mean, in a perfect world, I would of course love to see pledges on the table that very clearly outline that we have moved towards the pathway to limiting warming to 1.5. But then that's obviously a very broad question, and yeah, I think what's going to be interesting next year, what I would really like to see more active engagement and maybe a more concrete outcome would be the global goal on adaptation, that I think has been moved to the I will, as far as I know, there has been an agreement on a framework, but of course much needs to still be decided on that. But I also personally very much hope to actually be there, and I think Damon has a lot more to share on very concrete steps that are realistically on the table for next year. Just maybe to very briefly touch on a last question that has appeared in the chat on a potential update of the Stern report to quantify the cost of inaction and strengthening the economic argument. I do believe that we have quite a lot of information on this on the table, but it would certainly, I think, also be helpful to probably synthesize that very concretely. Again, even though we do have just very different measures also to really assess the impacts versus the economic costs. But yeah, it probably can't hurt to reiterate this time and again.
Thank you so much. And finally, Damon, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I'm going to stay optimistic in terms of my hopes in terms of what we've accomplished by next COP. And as Tabea said, I think, well, I'll say four things. Firstly, I think we do really need to see by next COP countries finally following through in terms of putting their words into actions through strengthened NDCs, the 2030 NDCs, and hopefully at least some countries showing leadership and bringing forward their new NDCs to the 2035 horizon that are 1.5 aligned. Like really stepping up and demonstrating through current and new NDCs that is where things are at, because we've had that very clear reinforcement out of this COP, and time is up for saying, "Oh, we'll do it next year." It really is now or never in terms of keeping 1.5 within reach. So I want to see that. Secondly, I would hope that there's very early and consistent demonstration from governments across the next year leading up to the next COP around sending the right signals around their interpretation and implementation of the energy package out of the COP, and ensuring that that's steering, as we were talking earlier, in the right direction, and would like to be arriving at COP, everyone's saying, gee, the concerns about loopholes and mixed messages were unfounded, because we've had all these governments really confirming that they genuinely are behind taking action in the right direction. Thirdly, by next COP, would hope that the Loss and Damage Fund is much more fully capitalised in terms of adding some zeros on the end, given, as has been mentioned, the really pressing and growing need for really significant amounts of funding to respond to the crises happening in across particularly vulnerable countries across SIDS and LDCs in particular. And fourthly, in terms of outcome from the COP, I mean, it's going to be a finance-focused COP in terms of really key deliverables. The new quantified goal is going to be central to that, but also really seeing follow through on things like doubling of adaptation finance, and seeing that demonstrated in a more fully fledged way. We know that that's only a floor. I think it only closes the adaptation gap by about 5% in terms of what's really needed. It's in the trillions. So a really strong demonstration of commitment across the finance landscape, I think, is going to be much needed and expected out of the COP next year. Thanks.
Thank you so much for these final interjections. Our discussions has made it apparent that the hard work is very much still in front of us, with implementation being our word of the day. Thank you so much to our great speakers for providing your insights, and I hope that this session today has left our audience with a better idea of what the road ahead will look like. And thank you to all of our participants as well who joined online today. Good afternoon, and thank you very much.